Sort of the heart of the interview, Rabbi, will be talking about traditions. And I thought, as an opener, I'd just ask you, how does the traditional Jewish funeral and burial
Mhm.
honor God and the person who has died? I know it's pretty broad, but
Sure. No, it's a fantastic question. So uh, there are there is a core prayer that is a major part of the Jewish tradition called the Kaddish, and it comes that word even Kaddish comes from the root stem, which means to make something holy. And we say the Kaddish multiple times throughout all of our worship services. But we also say it at the end of every daily worship. There's three daily worship services in a day, a morning, a midday, and an evening. And at the end of each of them, one of the final prayers that's said is called the Mourner's Kaddish, or Kaddish Yatom. Um, and in it, there is no mention of death.
hmm,
The prayer is explicitly in praise of God. Um, Yitgadal v'yitgadash shmei Rabbah. May God's name be created even larger and greater and more holy every moment of the day. And the prayer continues on in that way, saying that like even as we mourn our lost ones and our loved ones who we're not even talking about in this fundamental prayer, um, we are praising God for the gift of existence, for
hmm.
being our creator, for the covenantal relationship we have with God as Jews, and for the greatness of God's name. That's a piece of Deuteronomy. In the book of Deuteronomy, God talks a lot about you will know me by my name, and there will be a place where my name will become great. And this theology of increasing the good name of God um, underlines a major element of Jewish theology to the point where we have this idea of a Shem Tov, a good name, that God has a good name, and through God, we can have also a good name, that you, through your actions, build up a good name for yourself, and that your good name endures beyond the grave. And this is both theological and true, like a fundamental truth of existence, right? Like those who have done the right things in this world, who have lived by their principles, who live righteously, um, people remember them with love. And people who were awful, their name doesn't carry goodness after their death. Um, and our Talmud, our one of our major sections of wisdom, really says that the good deeds of a person are the monument that they build, the same as the headstone, and that there's no need to erect a monument for righteous people because their good deeds are that monument for them. We still do, by the way, but you don't have to. Is the idea is that your good deeds in this world, and similarly, the good deeds of the Jewish people make the name of God greater, which brings us back full circle, right? When you act in a loving, honorable, compassionate way, people don't just say, "Oh, how good was Plony." They say, "How good was Plony, and how good is the God of Plony?" Plony is the insert random name here that we use. In English, it would be John, right? John Smith. In
Okay.
Hebrew, it's Plony. So that I'm not saying something about someone that isn't true or is true. All those different things. Um, so that's talking about God, and I hope that answered the question
Oh, I
too
think it does. Yeah. So what you do in life matters after your life.
deeply, and depending on the theology, different Jews have different opinions on this. Judaism doesn't have an explicit afterlife mentioned in the Torah. Judaism does have an afterlife concept, a world to come that we discuss in later books. But if you check the five books of Moses, there's no mention of what happens to you after you die. Um, so there's no, um, it's not. as an it's not the same level of concern. I would say that most Jews don't walk around wondering, am I going to heaven? Am I going to hell? Because we don't have those concepts as core to our daily religious philosophy. We do believe that there is something that comes after death, a world to come. We don't know much about it. We're not supposed to learn too much about it either. The rabbis make a big deal about, like, don't worry too much about it. Worry on the world that you're in. And if you do the right thing in this world, you build up merit. And your merit and the merit of your family and the merit of your ancestors goes before God and helps make the case for you, both in this world and then the next. But you build a good name, you act with merit, and you live in this world concerned very much of this world. And that's how you be a mensch.
All right, thank you. A mensch, did you say?
A mensch, that's Yiddish for a good person.
Talk about some of the sort of the traditions that people would see when they go to a funeral of a Jewish person.
So it actually begins before death.
Okay.
Before someone dies, as they're in the, I mean, of course, if someone dies tragically and suddenly, and this does not apply, right?
Yeah, right.
But if someone is in the hospital and death is approaching, it is, some Jews will call the rabbi, who will come and recite, or a learned person. You can do it yourself, and they'll recite what's called the vidui, which is the confession. And the vidui basically says, look, lots of people have confessed and lived, and lots of people have refused to confess and have died. But I know that I'm mortal. I know that I am not perfect. And I confess the things that I did wrong, in the hopes that I will, that my good deeds, my good merits will go in front of me as I go into the next world. I'm not an expert in Catholic theology, so I'm not going to compare it to last rites in Catholicism. But it is fundamentally different in that it's not a promise. It's an aspirational activity, and it's not required. There's no penalty for not doing so.
Right. And as you said, not everyone can plan for their death.
Right. And not everyone can plan it. And just because you confess doesn't mean that you're forgiven either. There's also that fundamental difference. But as I said, I'm not an expert in Catholic theology and wouldn't pretend to be.
But that's how it would help a person prepare with the very concept personally.
Right. And also their family, especially in modernity, in the world that we live in today. Oftentimes, by the time I go see someone who is dying, they are in palliative care. They're deeply sedated. They're not truly present with us anymore. They're at the end of their life. So oftentimes the confession that I do on behalf of these people is not just for them, but it's also for their families, to state aloud, the person I love is dying. They're going to die soon. They were not perfect, but they deserve forgiveness and they deserve love. And then I tell people, this is not part of the Jewish tradition, but I do tell people that in these last moments of life, it's important for you to tell the person you love how much you love them, and to unburden. Don't leave things unsaid. That's more pastoral, though. That's my pastoral side, not my theological side. When someone dies, they are taken to a group called the Chevra Kadisha. And the Chevra Kadisha are volunteers amongst the Jewish community who have taken on a very high level mitzvah, a commandment, to care for the dead. And what they do is they wash the body and prepare it for burial. They wrap it in a shroud after they finish washing the person. We don't bury with we don't bury with things, right? We don't bury with jewelry. We don't bury with fancy clothes, et cetera, et cetera. We also don't embalm. We don't preserve. And normally, a funeral can be as quickly as the same day, and usually maximum 3 days later. Jewish holidays do prevent us from burying. We don't bury on our Sabbath, and we don't bury on the holidays, and we don't bury at night. But we do rush to bury the dead, in part because we don't do anything to preserve the body, no formaldehyde, no embalming, but also, very, very limited things. There are people who are flown to different locations, but even that it's speedy. And I'll get to the next piece of it in just a second. So the Chevra Kadisha washes the body, they shroud the body, and then a shomer, a guardian, is appointed to sit by the body until burial. And people will take turns in this role, and they usually sit by the body praying and reciting psalms. And in fact, when I do a burial, the funeral home gives me a piece of paper that has a list signed and dated and timed with each person who sat by the body. It's a very serious responsibility, and we don't leave the dead unattended. The body is then brought to the burial place within a few days, very quickly afterwards. And the family will usually at that point relieve the shomer of their responsibility. We then perform an act called kriya. Kriya, K-R-I-A, I think is the best transliteration I could give you.
Thank you. Which
means both to call and to rip and to tear. And it's a remnant of the Bronze Age, where you would hear the death of someone you loved and you would rend your garments and put on sackcloth and ash. So some people today still rip their clothing. They'll take a knife and they'll slash their collar, or they'll rip around. Some people put on a black ribbon, and we rip the ribbon in half to represent their torn hearts and their torn the tearing. And they'll wear that ribbon, or they'll wear that cut or torn shirt during the burial, and then in the 7 days that follow. Then we have a funeral, and the funeral liturgy is composed of a few psalms, often a eulogy. Sorry, the English word was escaping me for a moment. A eulogy. And then there are two prayers which are always said at the end. One is El Male Rachamim, which is translated to our God who is full of compassion. And that's a personalized prayer that is recited at the burial, asking God to take the soul of the dead into the sheltering presence, or quite literally the shadow of God's wings, is the translation.
And to take the soul of the dead to where again?
Into the shadow of God's wings.
The shadow of God's wing. Okay, that's quite eloquent.
Yeah. Then the person is buried. I'm not going through all of the funeral liturgy, obviously, but the person is buried, and it is the Jewish tradition to bury our dead ourselves. So the family, the mourners, each take turns putting earth into the grave until, at the very least, the casket is completely covered. There's no sign of it anymore. And in more traditional circles, they will fill the grave to the top. It's not something that's to be done by the people who work at the cemetery. It's the obligation of the mourners and those who love the dead.
Do they actually dig the grave itself?
We don't dig the cemetery attendants dig the grave, but the Jewish community fills the grave in.
Okay.
Just 2 weeks ago, I did a funeral for a young man, and they did not stop until there was a full grave. Then once the dead are buried, we finally say that Kaddish that I talked about, Kaddish Yatom, the mourner's Kaddish, by the graveside.
Mm-hmm.
And then it becomes the obligation of the mourners to say that prayer for that person for the next 7 days, 1 month, 1 year, in
And
that
that's the
order.
Kaddish.
Yeah, that's the Kaddish.
Is that
And
also the K?
yes, and then after the 1 year mark, you come to synagogue and recite Kaddish, or go to minyan, you go to prayer, and on the anniversary of death, you say Kaddish for that person in perpetuity on the anniversary of their death.
And where is it said, Rabbi?
It either in synagogue, or if you don't pray at a synagogue, for instance, you only need 10 people. You need 10 people to pray, but
No.
sometimes, like in Israel, for instance, you'll go to an office complex, and they'll pray, in the middle of the mailroom, because that's what we got the time for. Other people will,
Yeah.
any place where you pray, that's when you do it, on the anniversary of that person's death. Once the dead is buried, the family goes home to what's called the Shiva house to sit Shiva. Either it's the family's home or the home of the deceased. Sometimes, if, for instance, the deceased lived in Toronto, but all of their family had moved elsewhere, the Shiva home might be the home of the deceased person. They return from the cemetery and they eat a meal that has round food, cookies, donuts, eggs, bagels, to represent the circle of life. I'm not pulling your leg, I promise.
I like that. I like all that food you just mentioned.
Yeah. And then they receive visitors. And at the Shiva, it's not your job to be the host. You're not the host. Other people are coming to see you and to comfort you and to share things with you. And what I often tell my mourners is that the Shiva is as if synagogue came home to you. You don't come to synagogue, synagogue comes to you. Your people come to you. The prayer services are usually at your home. There are people who take on the obligation, the honor of being Shiva leaders, where they'll go around the city and they will go to the homes of the people who are mourning and lead the services for them. Very high honor to do that. And people sit in that way for 7 days. There's more rituals that go with Shiva and restrictions and obligations, but I don't want to go too far down that rabbit hole. In the modern world, the rule is still 7 days. Not everyone sits 7 days. Some people don't sit at all. Some people only sit for 3. But the religious tradition is to sit for the full 7, with a very brief break to go to synagogue on Shabbat, on the Sabbath. Sorry.
And Sabbath is always a Saturday. Is that right?
Jewish time begins at sundown. So it's Friday night to Saturday night.
Oh,
so
right.
So there won't be a Shiva minyan at their home on Friday night. They'll go to synagogue. And then Saturday evening, once the Sabbath is out, they will sometimes open the Shiva again to have people over, depending on what time of year we're in.
We're talking about some traditions, and you actually started getting into something that I was going to ask you about later, and that is how have death traditions changed over time? And let's say maybe in the last 40 or 50 years, maybe. And you mentioned one very clear one where 7 days is the tradition, but in modern times, it's probably more difficult for people to do the way we work and so on.
Right.
So 3 isn't unusual either, is what I heard you say.
So Judaism is ancient, right? Its roots are in the Bronze Age, and the traditions that we hold are drawn directly from the Torah. The different things that like inspire our mourning rituals, like I said, the calling, the crying, the ripping off the sackcloth, the ashes. So death traditions have changed a lot in the course of 3,000 plus years. Or depending on who you ask, they've always been this way and we've never changed them. And that depends on who you ask. And I'll leave that to others to discuss.
Sure. Some people would stay rigidly to the traditions.
Yes, and in fact, some people would argue that our traditions that we hold today are held the exact same way as they've always been, um, with no changes, as if people. Anyways,
So they
this is
would
a
feel that
major.
if you cut it down to 3 days, you're not doing it right.
Well, definitely, there
Yeah.
is definitely that feeling, and even the people who sit for 3 days are aware that they're shortening their obligation, um, which which is unfortunate because the Shiva is a tool of healing, because in a world where you suddenly have no normal, it gives you a new normal to hold on to. And Judaism is great at this in the sense of our death traditions are wonderful at giving you normalcy
Mm.
in times of lack of normalcy. We tell you when to come to synagogue. We put you with other people who are in the same moment as you, who are also coming to mourn for their people. We give you structure. We give you people who, we give you a specific time. This is what you're doing for this week. This is what you're doing for this month. This is what you're doing for this year. I said I wasn't really going to go into them, and I'm still not. There are restrictions that we put on mourners for the first year, saying don't go and do this thing, don't go and do that thing, don't. And there's also exceptions that we always allow for, but by and large, don't go to loud concerts and see live music. Don't go to big fancy parties. The things that allow you to regain structure in a structureless world. And then, of course, on the anniversary of death, we tell you to come back. We always want you here, but we tell you especially to come back, and so that it's, if you lost someone, today is July 23rd, and you always remember that July 23rd is the day you lost someone, that you can come to synagogue 3 times on that one day and be surrounded by people who are also in loss, a fresh loss, or who have been in that loss for many years. So we give normalcy in the face of something which is forever abnormal, right? When someone dies, your world has changed forever. It's never going to go back to the way it was.
You said you can go 3 times on one day of the anniversary of your loved one's death?
Right. I'm sorry. So Jewish prayer happens 3 times daily. It happens in the morning, it happens in the midday, and it happens in the evening. And
morning,
you can come, morning, midday, evening, and you can come to all 3 of those prayer services on the day of your loved one's anniversary of death and be supported.
But it isn't considered tradition that you have to go to all 3. You could just go to one, something like that.
So in the Orthodox world, which I'm not a part, so I won't pretend, but in the Orthodox world, prayer is not optional. Men go to pray 3 times a day. That is part of your obligation to God. In the liberal Jewish world, where prayer is not obligatory, we hope that you will come and observe in that way. 1 time would be wonderful. 3 times would be a lot. But if that's what you need, that's what you need. There is a difference between the different denominations in observance and how we hold on to obligations and commandedness.
And that holding on to obligations you've been, I think, saying is that it's one of the ways, not just the returning normalcy, but it helps you grieve.
Absolutely.
Here's the process. You've laid it out in your religion, right? Here's the process to grieve. You don't have to wonder about what you're supposed to do. You know, or you can ask your rabbi, and that person.
Yeah. And we don't say that grief ends at a certain time, but we do say that mourning ends at a certain time, right? And so maybe I'll counter that, and I'll say we tell you how to mourn. We don't tell you how to grieve, because we have very clear rules and structures on how one can mourn. And grief, we know, lives beyond a period of time, right? And grief is a circle, and grief is never a straight line. But mourning gives us ways to grieve in a healthy way.